In the tail end of 2015, Scott Cawthon announced that he'd signed a 3-book deal with Scholastic for Five Nights at Freddy's. His explanation for the necessity of these novels was as such. The truth is that after a while, lore can become so dense that there isn't room for a story anymore. Another truth is that what makes for a good game doesn't necessarily make for a good book. Sometimes the timeline gets so full that the only way to tell a real story is have the story set in a different timeline, an alternate universe, a different location, or perhaps from a vantage point that isn't entirely what it appears to be. And a few days later, the first book in the trilogy released, The Silver Eyes. The series follows Charlie, the daughter of the inventor of the animatronics Henry, and a group of childhood friends revisiting Freddy Fazbear's Pizza years after they split apart, following the disappearance of 5 children at the restaurant and subsequent closing. At the time of the novel, Charlie and friends reunite after 10 years for a vigil in memory of the missing children, and decide to go explore the old Freddy's location out of nostalgia, and thus hijinks ensue. While there are a lot of things the books have in common with their source material, for example, this book is the first time in the series we learned of Charlie, Henry, and William Afton, all characters who turned out to be key players in the main series. There's also a lot of key details that aren't the same. For example, in this continuity, Charlie is obviously not the puppet. For that matter, the puppet doesn't seem to exist in any capacity. And Henry ended his own life. Well, I suppose he also did in game canon, but it was a much more heroic and dramatic way. As for the quality of the book itself, well, it's decidedly fine. It isn't anything special as far as writing goes, but it's a fun romp that brings you back to classic FNAF. I would recommend giving it a read if that sounds enjoyable to you. It doesn't venture very far out of FNAF 1 through 3 territory, and I know a lot of people would probably prefer it that way. It's a relatively simple and enjoyable adventure. Next in the series is The Twisted Ones, my personal favorite entry. This book is set a year after the events of the first, and follows Charlie, John, and Jessica, 2 of her friends from the first book, going to school in Hurricane now. This is less than half the original cast size, which I think was a wise choice, because there were just so many characters in the first book that just didn't get an opportunity to do much of anything. Anyway, while they're studying in Utah, a series of gruesome murders has begun to take place, and upon closer inspection, they realize the deaths seem to be moving in Charlie's direction. Charlie and Co set off to solve this mystery, and thus more hijinks ensue. While I think The Silver Eyes is objectively better than The Twisted Ones, TTO is honestly just very fun and had me a lot more enthralled with the first book. I'll be the first to say it's batshit insane, but in a very much enjoyable and exciting way. But I digress. Let's talk about the finale of the story, as it's very important to set up the fourth closet. After discovering an underground pizzeria located beneath Henry's house, sound familiar? Charlie faces off with William, who now demands to be referred to as Springtrap, and asks why he took her twin brother, Sammy. For context, throughout the story, Charlie has been haunted by the memory of her brother Sammy being kidnapped by William when they were toddlers at Fredbear's family diner. Springtrap responds with, "I didn't take him, I took you." Soon after, Charlie has her final encounter with Twisted Freddy, wherein he shoves her into his stomach, thereby killing her. Outside of the door, Charlie has envisioned Sammy being behind throughout the book. Moments before the house collapses, John sees a dark-haired woman examining Charlie's body in the Freddy suit. However, in the epilogue, Charlie's friends are sitting at a diner reflecting on the events when, lo and behold, Charlie appears on the horizon. The final line of the book is John saying, "That's not Charlie." This brings us to the third and final entry in the trilogy, the fourth closet. So I've made my distaste for the fourth closet pretty clear in the past. A few years ago, I even made a parody of the book in Gotchaverse, which has amassed a fairly decent number of views. Also, while we're here, I want to talk about how amazing some of the comments under this video are, because some of them just astound me. Snowcore 2006 to 2019 died from watching something so funny she exploded. Actually, thank you for that one, that was nice. The fourth closet is OMG, I read that book, not fourth closet, I read FNAF books, Charlie and Friends, I Tap Charlie equals Elizabeth, ah ha 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 ha, and I love Funtime Freddy. Okay, enough talk. The book wasn't bad, it was amazing. You got some parts wrong too. Guys, I want to those that don't like the Book of Fourth Closet to stop saying it's bad. It's my fave book besides the graphic novels, but it's very good in my opinion. I get the ending could have been better, but still. This is actually very helpful. I have a book talk about this tomorrow, and I didn't get some stuff that is help a lot. Things like, I don't even know. Are you sure this happened in the book? First of all, you're using Gatch Life. Why are there swearing? Okay, first of all, you got almost all this wrong, and it is a bad example to kids that think they can just watch this instead of the book, and there's also no swearing. Mostly kids are watching this. Anyway, that aside, let's talk about the fourth closet. I still have yet to do a truly thorough write-up of my deal with this book, which actually surprises me considering how outspoken I am for my visceral frustration with the story and how it was handled. So let's do that today, shall we? However, I don't see any good in complaining if you're not going to do anything about it. So after I've come through the story from start to finish, I'm going to address my glaring issues with the story and try to rectify them. Viewers, I present to you my problems with the fourth closet and how to fix them. As usual, I'll be going through the story in narrative order and highlighting my problems as they appear in the story. Then, we'll go back through and address these points and what I would do to fix them. And of course, there will be major spoilers, so without further ado, let's get going. So, the book opens with John recalling the memory of the night of Charlie's death in an active construction zone. This actually sets a great precedent because John is such a viscerally frustrating character in this book. In the first couple of books, he was an overall just fine character. He didn't really bring a whole lot to the table, and his main story purpose is primarily just to be a love interest character for Charlie. While I generally dislike this archetype when it's not necessary, it won't break the story for me. But in this book, I really just cannot stand him. So for a little more context, it's been 6 months since the Twisted Ones at the time of the fourth closet, and John hasn't reached out to any of his friends since then, including Charlie, who John's insistent is not really Charlie. This book does actually bring back one of John's only actual traits that were briefly mentioned in the last 2 books, writing. He keeps journals documenting his investigations into the whole Charlie ordeal, since if that's not Charlie, who might it be? I have a couple problems with this already. First of all, the theories he comes up with all kinda suck. He writes for money and the best idea he has is secret evil twin sister? Really? Actually, this might have been a warning. But that I can forgive. Yeah, it's a little stupid, but it's FNAF, so what can you do? My second and more pressing issue is that this feels very creepy and weird. Since their childhood, the only time John has really spent with Charlie was the few days in the Silver Eyes and the few days in the Twisted Ones. Charlie and John's relationship is fueled solely by nostalgia, not a genuine bond. I mean, Charlie doesn't relate to both of their days in the Twisted Ones. She doesn't seem like she really feels that strongly. Might wanna let it go, John. What I'm trying to say is that John really doesn't know Charlie as well as he insists he does. I mean, he says as much himself, and this wouldn't be as much of a problem if he had actually spent more time with her and got to know her better. Then that line would make more sense to me. Like, he had been friends with her and they'd been close for a long time, but he always got the sense that she was holding something back, or he never really knew her on a spiritual level. As it stands, this line is just what it means. There's no subtext here at all. Anyway, let's continue with the story. After getting fired from his job, he comes across Jessica and she invites him to a get-together at the home of Clay, the chief of police in the town and the father of one of Charlie's other friends, Carlton. John insists that Charlie isn't who she says she is, and Jessica argues back that she's talked to her herself and she is certainly Charlie. And there's another problem. Jessica should know Charlie much better than John. They were literally roommates. They spent something like 6 months living with each other, which, yes, isn't a super long time in the grand scheme, but it's a whole lot more than the collective week and a half between John and Charlie, and in my experience, definitely enough time to get to know someone on a spiritual level. If anyone should be suspicious, it should be Jessica, the one who literally lived with her. If she still believes this is Charlie after all that, then John definitely should. Anyway, John reluctantly decides to go to the gathering and meets the rest of our main cast for this book. This story brings back Carlton and Marla from the Silver Eyes, in addition to John and Jessica. Generally, I don't have as much of an issue with the existence of these characters as I did in the Silver Eyes. Carlton is an enjoyable character who's well utilized, and while Marla doesn't do a whole lot in the story that couldn't be done by Jessica or Carlton, she's not a completely redundant inclusion. And honestly, good for Lamar, he made the right call here. Get out of there and don't look back. So John arrives at the party and Clay brings him into the kitchen to provide him a few words of comfort, since he knows things will probably be kind of awkward for him. And in response to this fatherly sympathy, what does John do? He stomps off like a child. This brings me to my next major problem with John's character in this book. So far, it may seem like I'm saying that he's not allowed to mourn or be traumatized after the event of the Twisted Ones, and of course that's not what I mean. Of course he'd be scarred after the event of that story, and he should be able to express that. However, John's behavior here seems much less like a response to his trauma and more like an inconsiderate child who's only concerned with his own feelings. When Jessica and Clay push him to reach out more and talk to Charlie, he's like, well, what about how I feel? He barely makes an effort to work past what happened, and this party scene is a perfect example of that. Clay tried to make him feel more comfortable, and his response is to just storm away. Anyway, here we get our first real encounter with Charlie. On his way out, John runs into Charlie, and she directly addresses that John thinks she's an imposter. So how does he respond? By grilling her and asking her a question that, even if she was the real Charlie, it'd be reasonable of her not to know the answer to. He asks her what his last words to her were, being, I love you. Not only is it incredibly stupid for him to act like this is the smoking gun because she very literally almost died moments later, I also find this to be a creepy and incelish question for him to ask. This is the thing that would make Charlie his, and unless she remembers his expression of admiration, then she's clearly not real and isn't his Charlie. Maybe she just isn't that interested, dude. This gets even worse a couple scenes later, when John goes on a date with Charlie, which is mostly just an interrogation session for him. The way he treats her in this scene is just so immensely disrespectful and inconsiderate. John has no real reason to believe this is not Charlie. The extent of his evidence is, Your Honor, I got bad vibes. Imposter Charlie is functionally indistinguishable from real Charlie. There's no reason for him to believe that this isn't her. With this in mind, consider that he gives his theories about her existence and posits to her that she's actually her abducted sibling and lying about her identity. Like, when Charlie calls him out for this, she's in her right. Like I said, she is indistinguishable from Charlie. Even if this is the imposter, it's the principle of the fact that he was willing to straight up say something like this to her face is what's fucked. And this wouldn't be as much of a problem if the narrative punished John for treating her this way, but no, it turns out that it's fine because she's not really Charlie, so that makes it completely okay to treat someone like this. Anyway, let's move on from this disastrous scene. After that encounter, John decides to pay Clay a visit to talk to him about the things regarding Charlie and her family. They talk about the Emilys, and Clay tells John that there are child abductions occurring again. Also, Clay has Ella in his house, which will be important later. After this little interaction, John leaves to go back out to his car, where he comes across none other than Baby. Upon seeing this, he quickly hops in his car and speeds away. This is just a little side note, and it's not really to do with anything, but I like how in the graphic novel the artist doesn't show the top half of Baby's face until the scene with Jessica. I find this to be an especially cool detail considering who she turns out to be at the end, but I digress. Meanwhile, shortly after John's departure, Clay is perusing his case files when suddenly he's interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Clay peers out into the hallway to see a figure in the house with him. Back with John, as he returns home, he finds that the decapitated head of Charlie's old toy rabbit Henry built for her, Theodore, which he held onto since she wasn't interested in it, mumbling Shining Star Silver Reef. John snatches up the head and rushes back to Clay's house, but when he gets there, he finds Clay severely wounded on the ground and quickly calls the hospital. Okay, I have a question. Why did John just leave and not think to warn Clay about the killer clown approaching his house? I get him wanting to get out of the car for his own safety, but wouldn't he at least want to wait and see what she was doing? They'd both been on high alert the whole night, and when we get Clay's perspective, it says he waited for John to leave, so wouldn't Clay figure that there was something afoot if John didn't move? I don't know, this wasn't the dumbest thing on John's part, but I feel like he could have done at least something else. So after this, Clay is hospitalized and John calls up Jessica, which I just found incredibly frustrating. John has spent the past half-year ghosting Jessica and avoiding her every time she's tried to reach out to him, and the only time he calls her up is so he can play his little detective game. She's not someone to be called up at your convenience, she also has a life, and an actual commitment, unlike you, John. Upon meeting Clay in the hospital, he gives John and Jessica an envelope of photos and tells them that it has to have a maximum range before passing out. Jessica opens the envelope and finds a bunch of stalker pictures of her friends, the one common thread between all of them being the presence of Charlie. I have to ask, why didn't Clay tell John about this before now? I get not wanting to worry him, but also he clearly knew that something was up after that little tantrum at the party. Why didn't Clay tell him about this the day before, when they'd met twice to talk about the deal with Charlie? He didn't even have to give him the photos or say the maximum range thing, just tell him that he'd been following them so it'd be a little less alarming. Anyway, John and Jessica leave the hospital, and on their way out meet a distressed mother who says that her son is missing and Clay's the only one taking it seriously. After this, John tells Jessica about the Shining Star Silver Reef thing. Jessica knows that it's a nearby ghost town, and hence they go to investigate. They arrive that evening and find a path with an arch with a star on it and a house at the end. The two approach the house and meet Charlie's Aunt Jen inside. John said they received her message, Shining Star Silver Reef, and she says that she wasn't responsible for that. John and Jessica come inside and ask her to tell them what she knows about Charlie, and Aunt Jen initially refuses to elaborate and delivers some vague lines about how secrets have petrified her to the world. However, a knock at the door sounds and she directs them to the back of the house. John and Jessica sneak to the back room while Aunt Jen answers the door to greet none other than Charlie. John opens a chest, and in it discovers an unconscious Charlie. With Imposter Charlie closing in, however, he takes her and hides her in the closet with Jessica, where they see Imposter Charlie scan the room before leaving via the window. John and Jessica quickly leave after her and ride off back to John's apartment with real Charlie's unconscious body in hand. Okay, I have a few things to say about this whole sequence. First of all, who transmitted the message through Theodore? Aunt Jen says that it wasn't her who did it, and if it wasn't her, then there isn't really any other possibility. William and Baby were trying to track down Aunt Jen themselves, so it couldn't have been them. The graphic novel tries to resolve this by having Charlie mumbling Shining Star Silver Reef while she's sleeping in the chest, but that doesn't solve much of anything either. How are her and Theodore linked? How is she transmitting this message? I guess this question will forever remain unanswered. Second of all, Aunt Jen herself. I'm so frustrated that Aunt Jen's appearance in this book was so stunted because she has the potential to be a very interesting character. She was the only normal person who was aware of the truth regarding Charlie, and based on her little spiel when John and Jessica went to ask her some questions, this knowledge had deeply affected her. There was some real room for an interesting exploration of her character and a look into the depths of the emotion she was feeling. But no, she's just unceremoniously killed off in one sentence of, and then she ripped her stomach out. By the way, that's another thing I want to talk about. Why does Imposter Charlie take such visceral pleasure in killing Aunt Jen? Like, killing her I obviously understand, because she knew too much to be left alive, but as far as we know, she never really wronged her personally. If she's mad at her for being locked in the closet for so long, why is she mad at Aunt Jen? That was Henry's doing, not hers. But again, I guess we won't ever know now since Aunt Jen is dead. But I digress. Let's move on from this sequence. Back at John's apartment, Jessica seems to be the only one with the brain as she tells John to take Charlie to the goddamn hospital. However, he instead opts to go to Clay's house to retrieve Ella. Jessica points out that she doesn't know what to do if Imposter Charlie shows up, and John tells her to bolt the door, and I don't know why he thought this would be effective because she literally shredded Clay's reinforced door to smithereens before. John goes to Clay's house, fetches Ella, and calls Jessica to tell her to meet him at the library. At the library, Jessica and John use the microfiche reader to examine the pictures Clay gave them, and when they zoom in very closely, they see none other than Circus Baby. However, they then realize that they left Charlie on her own, susceptible to being found by Imposter Charlie. I don't know how anyone could possibly read this without that glaring them in the face. When I read this book originally as an 11-year-old, I was like, what are you doing? Anyway, when they get back, they find Imposter Charlie right near their apartment and about to enter. So, I have to ask, why was the scene included? This is just contrived tension. Them leaving her unguarded didn't affect the progression of the plot at all. This library scene is actually cut from the graphic novel entirely, and instead just has Jessica discover the secret of the photos on her own, and I'm really glad because the whole library return sequence was so contrived and this proves it. Anyway, both versions have Jessica stalling Imposter Charlie outside while John hides real Charlie from her. This is then followed by a sequence of Imposter Charlie rooting around in John's apartment for signs of real Charlie, and honestly, this whole scene just came off as funny to me and not really intense. Jessica and John coming up with distractions to get Imposter Charlie out of there and fumbling over each other to stop her from finding real Charlie was comedy gold. Anyway, after this, John asks if she wants to go to dinner again that night so he can get more information out of her, and she agrees. I don't know why she agreed since she knows they're both onto her now, but whatever. That evening, Jessica and Carlton accompany John on his date to make sure all goes according to plan. Imposter Charlie quickly begins to grill him and asks what he was doing in Silverleaf. John's retaliation to this is to just flub the mission entirely and give away that he knows she's an imposter. While I kind of understand this, since she obviously knows that he's onto her, why didn't he at least try to maintain the conversation? And even worse, she literally stands up, kisses him on the cheek, and then goes to pay for their meal. He let her walk right over him, like he delivered all these threats to her and then just let her kiss him. Jessica, who's reasonably sick of everyone's bullshit, decides to take matters into her own hands and sneaks into Imposter Charlie's trunk to find out where her base of operations is. John caps off the scene by saying, "She did something stupid, didn't she?" about Jessica, to which I say, what? At least she's doing something at all and not letting herself be kissed by Imposter Charlie, unlike you whiny bitch. Jessica follows Charlie to Circus Babies, where she then follows her to the back door and encounters Imposter Charlie. I don't know why she thought it was a good idea to follow her all the way to the back, or at least keep it a safer distance, but unfortunately, Jessica is caught by Imposter Charlie and is then kidnapped in Circus Babies. When Jessica comes to, she finds herself tied to a chair in a room with Baby. This is actually a good opportunity to bring something else up, which isn't even really a problem with the story itself. I'm sorry, but Baby's design in the original poster for the fourth closet is just terrible. It looks so bad. Her face is weirdly inhuman, and it looks like the artist couldn't decide whether she wanted her to be more cartoonish or more realistic. Her pigtails are these weird wiry things that just look so strange, and her boobs are way too big and they're also weirdly lopsided. Her arms are so disproportionate and her thighs are way too thick. The book describes her as being elegant and feminine, yes, but this isn't pretty, it's just a weird and disturbing mash of desirable physical characteristics. But likewise, the graphic novel's design for her is absolutely amazing. I love this design so much. It's probably my favorite version of Baby across the series. I love how expressive the artist made her, with her faceplates conveying her emotions and her creepy and naturally wide smile. Her design in this book is just absolutely sublime and such a glow up compared to the original art. That being said, most of the art for the fourth classic graphic novel is just lovely. The art style is simple but charming and complements FNAF very well. All in all, it's a very good adaptation, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. But I digress. Baby then trauma dumps on Jessica about her daddy issues, and Jessica takes this opportunity to get herself loose and try to escape. During this scene, however, there's a part where Baby momentarily appears to Jessica as being Charlie, which is not at all how illusion discs work. This is something I'll get more into later in the finale of the book, but right now I just want to talk about it as it pertains to Baby. So in the Twisted Ones, the way the illusion discs work is that they flood your brain with nonsense and make your mind fill in the blanks with how something looks. In layman's terms, it changes how something looks to you based on your perception of the thing. In the Twisted Ones, the animatronics appear to them as being these horrific monstrosities since the characters feel negatively towards them. However, to a child who's seen them in advertisements and been marketed to them as a cuddly teddy bear, that's how they'll appear. But this is not how it goes in the fourth closet. In this book, their perception of Baby doesn't seem to affect how she's able to appear to them at all, which isn't how it works. John was suspicious of her from the very beginning, so she should have never appeared as looking like Charlie, at least not for the start. And when Jessica learns the truth about her, she should also stop being able to see her as Charlie. It sucks because this is such a fun concept and it has a lot of potential to be used in very interesting ways. Imagine that the closer John and Jessica get to the truth about the imposter, the more her appearance would fade and she would look less and less human. Imagine how cool that would have been. You could even go a step further and make her appearance look more or less like Charlie based on the scene. Like, she could appear as looking more like Charlie to John in the scene outside Clay's house at the party or during the first date. Scenes where he momentarily believes that it's really Charlie. Think! Think of how cool this could have been. If they abandoned the rules in the Twisted Ones for the sake of a more compelling story, then I would maybe be a little more lenient about this. But then making the illusion discs function in such a flippant way makes the story worse as a result. What was the point? But I digress. Jessica manages to free herself and escapes down the hall where she comes face to face with Springtrap. After putting on his little show for her, he then collapses and the real William emerges from the darkness. I have another question now. Why is William like this now? In the first 2 books in the series, William was a lonely psycho furry, which, okay, he made her a fun villain of the Twisted Ones, and I think was a good portrayal of him as a villain. But in this book, he's a lot more like his game counterpart. He's just a crotchety old mad scientist. Why is he like this in this book? Comparing him in the first 2 books to this one is like night and day. They might as well be 2 entirely separate characters. This William wants to achieve immortality because, I don't know, sounds cool I guess. What his actual goal is isn't very clear because it's so clouded in all of this meaningless verbosity, so he's just an annoying old British guy. It's very confusing. Also, why did William decide to discard Springtrap? He doesn't really benefit from losing the suit. In fact, it seems to put him in a worse position. Springtrap gives William more versatility and mobility, and seemingly more control over the animatronics too. Also, he's probably more resistant to attacks when he's inside Springtrap. Springtrap definitely isn't super sturdy, but he's definitely much more protective than the frail, crusty old man we see in the 4th closet. So again, I ask, why? Anyway, after William goes on his whole spiel to Jessica about whatever nonsense, Baby then forces Jessica to help her do surgery on him. I actually quite like this scene. I think it was cool to have Jessica try to distract herself from the horror of it all by thinking about something she likes, and I like how grotesquely it's described. However, it does highlight another overall issue of the book in the disparity of what the book decides to spend a lot of time describing. Like, compare the scene to Aunt Jen's death. We get a gratuitously vivid description of Baby, like, body-slamming a kidney into William, and Aunt Jen just gets, and then she ripped her stomach out. Can you keep your style of writing consistent because it can feel very jarring when you do that? Let's catch up with our friends back at John's apartment. John has contacted Marla and Carlton to come help deal with the whole Charlie situation, which was actually a pretty smart decision on his part. Actually, it was more Jessica's idea, but shh, let's let him have this one. John shows them Ella and turns on the illusion disc on her, causing her to appear as a real little girl. The audio also causes Carlton and Marla to become nauseous immediately, which raises another question. If the illusion discs make them feel sick, then how come Imposter Charlie never made them feel like that? She had an illusion disc on around them literally all the time, and nobody said anything about a headache or feeling like vomiting. Add that one to the list of this book's illusion disc plot holes, I guess. Anyway, John then suggests that they go get Charlie's earpieces from her project in the Twisted Ones and reverse engineer them so that they make them invisible to the animatronics. They actually changed this in the graphic novel, so Charlie's the one who suggests it instead, which is a very welcome change. In the Twisted Ones, Charlie explained her project to John in a way a child could understand, and he was still confused by it. It makes no sense for him to be the one to propose this idea. Like, John explains how her project works to her, and she's all like, I guess? This ties into another very major issue I'll talk about later. So Carlton, with Jessica's keys, goes to her apartment to retrieve the earpieces since she kept all of Charlie's old stuff. By the way, I want to talk about how little urgency the characters are going about all this with. Like, Jessica followed Baby back to the restaurant, someone who's nearly killed someone once and successfully another time, and she hasn't turned up for a while. They don't seem to be all that concerned with her safety. Carlton enters Jessica's apartment and finds the earpieces. He switches around the wires in them successfully on the first try, somehow before Imposter Charlie shows up. Look, I don't doubt that Carlton could figure it out without too much difficulty, but it's awfully convenient he managed to get the right combination on his first attempt the exact moment Baby showed up. Baby then tries to kiss Carlton, and he uses this opportunity to test the earpieces, and they work like a charm. Also, Baby has this weird thing with kissing people without warning in this book. It's very strange. The rest of the scene consists of Baby wondering where Carlton went and looking everywhere for him, which results in some really funny panels in the graphic novel. Also, this isn't really a complaint, mostly just a thing that I thought about for years, but Baby just lifts the bed off the ground. She just one-handed lifts the fucking bed, right off the ground. I don't know why, but this has plagued me for years on end, and it's lived in my mind rent-free for the past 4 years. Every night I lie awake thinking about this. My nightmares of Baby picking up beds aside, let's go check up on John and Charlie. Charlie's woken up again and is talking with John about what's happened since her little nap. And here comes another John moment where he gets mad at Charlie for not knowing the answers to questions she, reasonably, doesn't know the answers to. She's been out cold for 6 months, I don't really know what you want from her. Charlie suggests going back to Aunt Jen's house to see if there are any answers to be found there. They set off, and just as they leave, Carlton comes back with the earpieces. He asks Marla where they went, and she said they wouldn't tell her, which is weird to me. Why would they not want to tell her where they were going? But anyway, Carlton and Marla set off to go rescue Jessica. Speaking of Jessica, let's go catch up with her. After the surgery, she wakes up in a dark room surrounded by a bunch of children who she realizes are the kidnapped kids. Okay, there's a couple things here already. First of all, why is Jessica alive? What reason did William have to keep her alive? There isn't anything to indicate that he had anything done to her while she was unconscious, so she wasn't the subject of an experiment or anything. And for that matter, why are the kids still alive? William has never kidnapped, just killed. It's kind of his MO. It would make sense if it was for him to experiment on them, and this is kind of supported when William tries to inject one of the kids with Remnant later, but that child wasn't supposed to be there. He just wound up there trying to escape Mangle. There's no indication that he was lined up to be experimented on. So Jessica, now the leader of this gaggle of terrified children, is going to help them escape the pizzeria. When she opens the door to the small room, she comes face to face with Mangle, a welcome inclusion. After Jessica yells at it a little, it then comes and snatches up one of the kids. For now, Jessica decides to focus on trying to get the remaining kids out safely. Meanwhile, Carlton and Marla are breaking into the pizzeria. After lockpicking their way in and testing the earpieces on what are basically the novel equivalent of the Biddy Babs, they enter the mirror maze to go deeper into the restaurant. In the maze, we have our first encounter with everyone's favorite purple teddy bear, Funtime Freddy. There's a part in this whole sequence where Carlton loses his earpiece and is about to be caught by Freddy, but then Marla tosses it to him in the nick of time. This part was so clearly written by someone who's used to writing video games, because the way so many of the scenes in this book are set up would probably have some kind of win-lose condition if they were adapted as a game. Like, you would probably have to button mash to break free if you were playing as Carlton here, and that would be fine if it were actually a game. But novels and video games are two different storytelling mediums, so when you're just reading the story and not interacting with it, things like this are just pointless and disruptive to the progression of the story. Anyway, after getting past the mirror maze, Jessica unites with Carlton and Marla and explains to the pack of children that one of them was captured by Mangle. Jessica and Marla decide to escort the group of kids out of the building while Carlton goes after the last one that was taken. Also, Carlton gives Jessica his AirPod. Jessica and Marla get back to the arcade, where the Biddy Babs start chasing after them, and the explanation for this is that the children don't have earpieces, making them visible to the animatronics. But don't the earpieces affect an area, not just an individual? That's how they worked in the Twisted Ones during that whole Balloon Boy scene. But this book has seemed to forget about the Twisted Ones altogether, so I suppose we shouldn't question it. Jessica and Marla manage to get rid of the Biddy Babs, and Marla gets the kids out while Jessica distracts Mangle. There's then this whole sequence of Mangle chasing Jessica around a play structure and her getting them entangled in one of those play nets before escaping the pizzeria. It's total filler, but it's pretty fun and a nice breath of fresh air from the whole imposter Charlie BS. This part does actually cover the graphic novel and just has Jessica narrowly escape through event, which I'm kinda sad about. I understand why it was cut, but also I would really like to have seen a visual adaptation of this scene. Meanwhile, Carlton's going deeper into the pizzeria to save the last kid. After running around the vents for a little, he encounters Funtime Freddy again, and then subsequently destroys him with a giant indoor attraction, which was honestly a great scene. After this, Carlton runs around more and passes out from his exhaustion, thinking that he's doomed to die here in what was actually a pretty effectively sad scene. Shortly after, Carlton wakes up next to a big door and naturally goes inside. Within, he finds none other than the final child cowering in the corner who tells Carlton to help him first, and directs him to the molten amalgamation of the FNAF 1 animatronics lying on an operating table in the corner. For context, there's been this vague side plot going on that's been interspersed with the main storyline involving Baby retrieving the remains of the FNAF 1 endoskeletons from the original missing children incident, and William using them to harvest Remnant, which seems to be an excruciatingly torturous process for them. William then approaches the child wielding a syringe of Remnant, but Carlton intercepts it and seems to be killed by it. He then wakes up in an ethereal version of the original Freddy Fazbear's with the missing children's spirits. The spirits still seem to believe that Spring Bonnie is their friend, and there's a Spring Bonnie experimenting on the animatronic amalgamate on the table in the middle of the room. Carlton makes them realize that William is not their friend and wants to hurt them and draws an angry Bonnie. Back on the surface world, the amalgamation defies William's control and grabs him, throwing him into the furnace and finishing him off for good. Probably. With William finally dead for real, the spirits are finally liberated, but Carlton is still dying. Michael Brooks presses the completed drawing to his chest, with this presumably being the thing that ultimately saved his life, as it reappears in the hospital at the end of the book with Jessica telling him that she figured he would want it. As Carlton comes to, paramedics rush around him. All in all, I really like the Spirit World scene. It's a heartwarming and bittersweet conclusion to the MCI conflict, and gives Carlton a satisfying arc as well. It's probably the best scene in the book, to be entirely honest. Anyway, that's the end of the pizzeria part. Let's catch back up with Charlie and John. Before that, though, there is something else I wanted to mention regarding the pacing. The structure of the climax is very jarring and awkward to read because it keeps switching between the perspectives of Charlie and Carlton, and it will just interrupt one to cut to the other. This might make sense if the two perspectives converge, but for all intents and purposes, these are two separate narratives. For the sake of this video, I split them into two parts, but if I were to follow the original story exactly, you'd probably be very confused, in which case, congratulations, you just experienced how it feels to read this book. This is made even worse by the fact that two climaxes are very tonally different. While the pizzeria is more action-based and intense, Charlie's whole deal is much more of an emotional climax, an existential crisis of sorts. It's very tonally off-putting when we switch from this very emotionally driven scene of Baby revealing her tragic backstory to Carlton hitting Funtime Freddy with a carousel. While this issue is most glaring in the climax, it can really be found throughout the story. The perspective shifts so much, and it's always so unnatural, because the story will just interrupt itself to switch POVs, like there won't be a chapter break or anything, it'll just suddenly change. And there's also too many characters whose perspectives we switch to. We switch from John to Jessica to Clay to Carlton to even Baby sometimes. It's like the story remembers it has other characters and it's like, oh yeah, we should probably catch up with them. But I digress, let's finish out this story already. John and Charlie go to Aunt Jen's house and John breaks the news to her that Aunt Jen was killed by imposter Charlie. And Charlie's response to the woman who cared for her for the better part of her life dying is... barely anything. Charlie barely cares when she's informed of this. John even offers to go in before her and move Aunt Jen's body out of view, and she's just like, nah, it's fine. This woman took care of her for the better part of her life, and was probably a better parent than Henry based on what we learned in the finale. And while her and Charlie didn't seem to be particularly close, one would think she'd feel emotions at least a little stronger than, oh, that sucks. John and Charlie go to the back room Charlie was found in. There, they find boxes of Henry's old belongings, among them schematics for a version of Ella that was seemingly designed to grow alongside Charlie, and Henry's suicide note addressed to Aunt Jen. After getting around some more, though, an uninvited guest shows up. Baby. Okay, I'm sorry for interrupting this, but the illusion disc thing is more egregious now than ever. Maybe I can forgive John and Jessica in the first half of the book, but Charlie herself should know with 100% certainty that that's not her. But whatever, I've given up on this book following its own established rules. Baby tells Charlie to come home with her, and John tries to ambush her with the chair, but before he can hit her, she just turns around and bitch slaps him in an amazing scene. Honestly, he got what was coming to him. You get that, Baby. Charlie, understandably exasperated by all of this, begs that Baby explains to her who the fuck either of them are and what the hell is going on. This begins an extended series of flashbacks consisting of Baby explaining everything. First, Baby tells her own backstory, and we see how Elizabeth was killed. I actually like the scene pretty well. It's a good portrayal of how little William cared for his daughter, and how desperately the poor girl just wanted her father to love her. Elizabeth stealing her teacher's makeup to try to make herself look like Baby so her father would love her was so immensely sad. After this, Elizabeth then shifts her attention to telling Charlie her backstory, and... Okay. I'm gonna try to get through this without flipping my shit because this whole twist makes me more angry than a FNAF novel reasonably should make someone. Elizabeth reveals that it was not Sammy who died, but rather Charlie herself, and the Charlie we've been following is a robot replica of her Henry made to alleviate his grief. Henry made 4 different models of his Charlie since she had to grow up. A toddler, a girl, a teenager, and a woman. Then she would be complete. Each model was imbued with his emotions towards it. The first one wouldn't stop crying. She was influenced by Henry's despair over his daughter's death. The second one was created at the height of Henry's insanity, enveloped in the world of lies he created for himself. The third Charlie, our Charlie, was strange, created at an inflection point. Finally, the fourth one was made with Henry's anger, and the fourth one, set free from the fourth closet, was Elizabeth, filled with Henry's hatred for his creation. Elizabeth was the silver-eyed endoskeleton from the first book, the one Charlie described as being in pain. William Afton stole her, hoping to replicate what made Charlie special, and Henry stole her right back and locked her in the fourth closet. The thing that gave Charlie the capacity for humanity was Ella, Charlie's doll that Henry wept into and poured all of his grief into. Okay, there's a lot here. I'm gonna unpack this bit by bit because there's just so much to talk about, and there's things I do like and things I don't. Massive props to ScullyBo7 on Reddit for compiling all the issues with this. Many of my points are taken pretty much directly from her post, and I'll leave the link to her original post in the description if you want to see her take on the matter. First and foremost is the illusion disc problem. There's so many issues here, it just glares you in the face if you think about it for all of half a second. First of all, illusion discs don't necessarily work on everyone. What about deaf people? How does it affect hearing aids or headphones? Additionally, everyone in Hurricane perceives Charlie the exact same way. You're telling me that every single person in this town looked at Charlie and saw a sweet little girl with frizzy brown hair and buck teeth. Again, that is not how it works. Not everyone would see Charlie the exact same way. Maybe if they were given a description of Charlie as being this perfect child, they would see her like that, but people who've never met her may see her as looking entirely different from the one we recognize. Audio discs don't just make things look however you want them to, it's based on the viewer's perception. Secondly is the fact that Charlie very vividly remembers Sammy's, or rather, her, kidnapping. In fact, it's her main motivating factor in the Twisted Ones. This does not make sense. Charlie is not possessed by her real spirit, Elizabeth says as much herself, so that doesn't explain it. The only possible explanation for this is that Henry created this memory himself, as he did with her other core memories. To which I say, why? How does anyone benefit from this? Wasn't the point of this whole project so Henry could avoid the grief of his daughter's loss? Will this memory not just create more pain for both him and Charlie? Why would he do this? There's also the very basic problem of the fact that Charlie can perform virtually every human function. The blood is explained, but that's literally all. She cries, feels pain, sweats, breathes, blushes, is able to eat food and drink water, washes her hands, does not have rigid autonomy. I could go on. While some of these I can be lenient with, when they keep piling up like this, it starts getting difficult to suspend my disbelief. But worse than any illusion disc bullshittery is the fact that Charlie died and people knew. This wasn't some secret thing that happened like Elizabeth's death, this was an event that happened that people were very well aware of. Not only that, but this is a missing child. A crime of that caliber would become statewide, if not national news very quickly. Even worse, Charlie literally has a grave in Hurricane. The book even seems to lampshade how stupid this is, since John points out earlier that he never saw Sammy's tomb for himself. How? How did Henry get away with this for so long? It makes genuinely zero sense that nobody in Hurricane questioned this at all except for Kind of Clay. But I think the worst crime of this twist, or the lack thereof, is just that. The events of the climax at Aunt Jen's house have virtually no effect on the story. There's barely anything that makes you look back and think of the story differently. It seems like it was included just because it seemed like a kind of cool idea. You could cut this part entirely and the story would barely change. Maybe I could look past the issues and illogicalities of the twist if they actually did something interesting with it. But no, they barely do anything narratively fun or interesting with the concept. Okay, I promised I wouldn't get too mad about this. Deep breaths. Before we get on to the very end of this godforsaken novel, let's talk about some things I did like about the twist, because I don't think it is inherently bad, for as much as I just tore into it. First of all, I think the idea that Henry's feelings manifested in his work and affected their behavior is a cool idea, and I would like to see more be done with the idea in the mainline games. It's smart for Baby to actually be a Charlie and not just Elizabeth. It gives her a lot more depth and a better reason to hold so much resentment towards Charlie. Also, while Henry is frustrating, he is a sympathetic character. Him attaching himself to and pouring all of his love and grief into Charlie's doll was genuinely very sad to see, and the scene of him sobbing into Ella was portrayed very well. I also like Elizabeth's little snark of his method of mourning being very unhealthy. There's also a flashback where Aunt Jen is trying to get Henry to stop this madness, and notes that he can get the tea kettle to tell him his life story. Perhaps he's a stand-in for how you should feel as a reader. You and me both, Aunt Jen. You and me both. Okay, and that's everything I have to say about the twist. Probably the most egregious issue in this first draft of the book. Let's get this over with already. After her whole spiel, Elizabeth reaches into Charlie's stomach and tears out the essence of her being, Ella. She then further laments her awful life of shitty fathers and once again asks what it is that makes Charlie so special. Charlie then drags herself across the floor to a desk and hits Elizabeth in the face with a rock. She uses this opportunity to escape to a small closet across the hall, and inside finds the robot Henry constructed to end his own life. Elizabeth follows her into the closet, having Charlie cornered, and as she hears John wake up in the other room, she says in Charlie's voice that she'll be right out, and also morphs her appearance to look exactly like Charlie 3. Okay, a couple things about this. First of all, if Elizabeth could always make herself look like Charlie 3, why didn't she? What was the point of being Charlie 4? Second of all, how was she able to appear human regardless? Charlie hitting her with the rock seemed to shatter the illusion in some capacity, and it exposed some wires in her face. How come she just look exactly like a normal human again? But, whatever. As I've learned, consistency is too much to ask of this story. Trapped in the closet together, and with Elizabeth seconds from finally finishing her off, Charlie trips the suicide bot behind her, impaling both herself and Elizabeth. In her final moment, Charlie clutches Elizabeth's hand, and with the last of her strength, pushes Ella up the blade towards her. Moments later, John comes across their bodies. Finally, we've reached the epilogue. We get a scene of Carlton in the hospital with his friends as well as Clay, where we learn that all the missing children have been safely returned to their parents, and Jessica gives Carlton Michael's drawing, which is found with him at Circus Babies. As for Charlie, nobody seems to quite know where she is, and Clay says that he's investigating. After this, we get a scene of John visiting the cemetery again. When he goes to the back of the cemetery, he sees a woman beckoning to him. The book ends on a lingering shot of Charlie's grave as John and the woman walk into the distance. And we are finally finished! Okay, those final few scenes had a lot to unpack, so let's talk about those, shall we? First of all, am I the only one who finds it rather gauche of the book to have Charlie take her own life the same way her father did, and then frame it as the right thing to do? Like, something about this feels distasteful. I don't know if it's just me, but something about it seems wrong. Second of all, what's the deal with the woman in the epilogue? Obviously you're supposed to think this is Charlie, but narratively it feels weird. Symbolically, Charlie pushing Ella towards Elizabeth seems like it's supposed to represent her moving into that fourth body, but then doesn't that kind of take away from the ending? The point of her dying is to end this horrible cycle. Doesn't her coming back at the end defeat the purpose of that? Speaking of which, this book punishes Elizabeth way too much. Was she necessarily a good person? No, she kidnapped children. But still, she did have a pretty shitty life. She was in pain at all hours as a robot and ignored by her father as a human. Like she said, even when she gave herself up to William to research her, she still wasn't enough for him. Perhaps Elizabeth did deserve some kind of comeuppance, but she didn't deserve such a cruel end. Justice for my girl. However, the worst part of all of this is a perfect demonstration of one of my primary issues with this book, and it's the fact that Charlie does jack shit in this story. She sleeps for 75% of the time, then she hits Baby with the rock, and then she dies. That is genuinely all she does. The character Charlie does not do anything to affect the story. She is a husk of a character. She feels basically nothing towards the events unfolding around her. When Aunt Jen died? Oh well, sucks. She barely had a reaction to Elizabeth revealing that her entire life was quite literally a lie, and that she's actually dead. No existential crisis, nothing. In fact, she barely says a word about it at all. The only thing she says after this whole sequence is her line before she kills herself and Elizabeth. Elizabeth seemed to care more about the reveal than Charlie herself, for fuck's sake. Elizabeth dying here was far more upsetting than Charlie dying, especially with that final line. Charlie's a shadow of a person for men to project their ideal person onto. For John, his ideal girlfriend. For Henry, his ideal daughter. For William, his ideal research subject. Take Charlie herself out of the story and barely anything would change. She's not a character, she's a plot device. I would not get nearly as riled up about the twist if she actually did something with it. Ultimately, I think my main issue with this book is not any kind of illusionist nonsense or robot plot twists or Johns. My primary issue with this book is the heaps of wasted potential. This is the thing that makes me so angry. The concepts presented are not bad in and of themselves, quite the opposite, in fact. If they're executed well, the ideas here can be pretty goddamn cool. I already talked about illusion discs, but it definitely goes further than that. We could have gotten a lot more with Aunt Jen. Like I said before, she was the only one who knew the truth. We could have gotten a lot more interesting exploration, but she's killed off in a single sentence. What about Sammy, the one Charlie was so fixated on throughout all of the Twisted Ones? Elizabeth says that he's alive after all. Why wasn't he the one in the epilogue, coming back to Hurricane to reflect upon how the experience with Freddy tore his family apart? William got basically no time to do anything. The only times we really saw him were when Jessica was kidnapped and when he was killed by the amalgamation. He really didn't do anything. Elizabeth was the one who did most of the antagonist stuff in this book. Even Elizabeth, who's basically the main antagonist of the book, has untouched potential. Like I said, she deserves some better closure. I don't think she should have had an ideal happy ending necessarily, but the fact that the ending implies that Charlie basically stole her body is very fucked. She said that the reason she was so hateful is that she was never enough for anyone, and this just makes it that much worse. It really drives home that she isn't Charlie, and she never will be Charlie. She will never be the image of perfection that the men in her life want her to be. It's not like she was an evil person who got her righteous justice. She was a sad and angry girl who just wanted someone to love her. She didn't deserve to go out so brutally. I'm not saying that all these things deserved a thorough examination, but at least a few are worth more pages. Yes, it's FNAF, there's inevitably gonna be things that are sidelined. But there's just so much here that went to waste, and it's so upsetting to think about what this book could have been. So, how can we fix these issues? Well, my friends, we'll find that out in part 2 of this video, where we'll go over the changes I would make based on my critiques here. After that, I'll tie it all up into one coherent narrative and present my improved cut of the fourth closet. Hey there, thanks for watching! This video was originally going to be only one part, but as I kept writing it, it became increasingly clear that splitting it into 2 parts was the more intuitive option, so I apologize to the 2 people in the world watching who care for making you wait. To you two, if you enjoyed this video and want to see part 2, I would very much appreciate it if you liked or commented, or even subscribed if you're feeling really nice. With all of that said, I appreciate you so much for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in part 2. Goodbye!